Is it biblical for women to lead a church? Is it right for women to teach in church? Is it biblical for women to lead congregations? This issue has generated a lot of controversy over the years. Many preachers said women can preach. Some said women should not preach. Some said it's a shame for a woman to even speak. Well, you may have your own opinions about it, but I'll give mine based on the scriptures. I believe a woman should teach and preach in church. I have no problem with that. First of all, because we don't see anywhere in the Bible where Jesus Christ was against women teaching. And right from Genesis down to the time of Jesus, women always played significant leadership roles. So the issue is, should women lead? Yes, women should lead. We see Deborah leading as a judge in Israel. We see Jael performing a role, helping Barak to kill Sisera. We see women playing significant roles in scriptures throughout Genesis, even unto the time of Jesus. And Jesus had no problem with women preaching. This is why I say women can teach. Okay, women can lead. God places no restrictions on women teaching. First of all, the woman is not inferior to the man. The woman is another version of man. Have this understanding. The woman is not inferior to the man. Before God, both the man and the woman are equal. The woman is simply another version of man. You are male, she is female. It's just another version of human. She is equal before God as you are equal before God. God does not love the man more than he loves the woman. It's just that the role that the woman plays is different from the role that the man plays. Concerning leadership have always been a subject of debate in church, but the thing is that leadership based on gender differs in different aspects of life. In marriage, the man is the head and the woman supports the man. But in leadership, as in leading nations, God does not select genders. God can choose anybody to lead a nation. We see in the book of Judges how Deborah led Israel as a judge. And so many people think women should not lead. Women should only be subjugated to silence, to submission in church. Church should only be led by men. Women should just be silent, don't speak at all. That's slavery and that's bigotry, that's misogyny, and it's evil before God. If Deborah could lead an entire nation, then the church is small. They can handle the church. If a woman can lead an entire army, remember Barak, the captain of the army, was under Deborah, a woman, and God had no problem with it. If God could have no problem with a woman leading a nation, why would God have a problem with a woman leading a congregation? A nation is way bigger than the congregation. We have thousands upon thousands of churches in Nigeria, and yet not all Nigerians are Christians, but yet churches are full. So if a woman could lead an entire nation, why can't a woman lead a church congregation? That's the first reason I think it's okay for women to teach. Women should pastor churches if God is leading them to pastor churches. The second reason I think women should pastor churches is because God said that women will operate in gifts of the Spirit. Joel chapter 2 verse 28 says that in the latter days I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy. So there will be prophets and prophetess. Women will be anointed to prophesy. How can women prophesy if they don't speak? If they don't have a ministry of prophecy? If they are always silent, how would they communicate the message God is giving them? How would they be able to relate what God is saying if they don't speak in church? You see, if we restrict the women from speaking, even when God is calling them to ministry, then we are standing in God's way and we are fighting God directly. God is the one that gives gifts to men. God gives abilities to men, and you are not the one to tell God who He gives it to. God can call a woman to pastor a church. Okay? God can call a woman to lead a church. God can call the woman to preach the gospel, and you are not the one to tell the woman not to do it. Okay, so God can call the woman to start up a fellowship of people. What's the church? 2 or 3 gathered in my name, in God's name. So God can call a woman to handle a church and empower her with the grace she needs to handle that ministry. The Bible says that the woman is the helper of the man in marriage. And if God has called the man to ministry, why can't the woman help him in ministry? If the woman is silent and not to act, not to speak, how then can a woman help him fulfill his ministry? You see that this doctrine that restricts women from functioning in church is actually devilish. The third reason is because Jesus Christ never restricted women in any way. The first evangelists of the New Testament were women. The women were the first people who spread the good news to people. The woman of Samaria went and told the men of the city to come see a man who have told her all she ever did. A woman preached to a whole city about Jesus. This is before Jesus even died. So women have been useful, and women are still useful to God. Jesus Christ never rejected the women, and so if God in the flesh did not reject women, did not restrict them, why should we? If Jesus wanted to restrict women, He would have told us. He spent a lot of time with the disciples. He would have told them that in this church that you are going to start, women should not perform. Listen, a woman has equal rights with God as men do. Jesus never restricted the woman, not even the children, in any way. God's Spirit is going to fall on all flesh, including children. So how will you restrict the women and restrict the children from functioning when God has given them the grace and is telling them to function? Means you are an enemy of God. Means you are fighting the gift and fighting the grace of God. It means you are doing the work of Satan in trying to restrict God's work. God can use anybody to do His work. God can use anybody. I've seen God use women in miraculous ways, healing the sick, raising the dead. I've seen God use women to pastor mega churches and lead people to Christ. It's not the gender, it's the person. God can empower anybody. If God can use an animal to speak to Balaam, is it Balak? I don't know. But the prophet Balaam, if God can use an animal to speak his word, why can't God use a woman to speak? You see how we have turned the church into a men's cult? You have turned the church into something else. God doesn't want the church to become a cult. God doesn't want the church to become a cult. The women have equal right before God, and the women have all the right to function in a service, to function in a church service. Okay? Now you may tell me about Paul, the apostle, who said that that women should not preach in churches. First of all, when reading the epistles of the scriptures, you must separate between the revelations of God and the opinions of men. Paul was a man, and in writing a letter to a church, you would have your own opinions that you wrote there. If we took all the opinions of Paul as doctrine, then we'll live a confused life, because Paul said that it's good for men not to marry. Who will listen to him? So Paul also had in his own opinions, which cannot be taken as doctrine because they were mere opinions and not revelations from God. The only things about Paul that we can take as doctrine is if it was confirmed by Jesus or any of the apostles. Note that the apostles also disagree with Paul, even as we have disagreements in church today. The apostles also had their own disagreements. James and Paul disagreed on the matter of grace. That's why you see James talking about faith and works, while Paul talking about only faith without works. You see Peter talking about the simplicity of the gospel and how the gospel must be preached to everybody. And Paul, being a lawyer, stood and rebuked him. Rebuked Peter publicly, and Paul will later come back to say you should not rebuke elders. So Paul was a man who made his mistakes clearly in scriptures. We are not worshiping Paul, we are worshiping Jesus. Paul is not our role model. Jesus is our role model. Forget whatever Paul said. Paul is not Jesus. That was his opinion, not the biblical fact. He was the only one who restricted women from his churches. Peter didn't do so. James didn't do so. Other apostles did not do so. Only Paul. So, would you side with Paul and reject all other apostles? Come on, follow Christ. Stop worshiping Paul. Worship Jesus Christ. Woman, if you are listening to me and you're a woman, and God is calling you to open a church, better start planning on how to build that church. If God called you to prophesy as a woman, start working with God to be a prophet. The Bible says, and God gave some apostles, some pastors, some teachers, evangelists, and prophets. You're not the one who calls men. Allow God who calls men to call men. God called men and women. He calls people. God can call a woman as a prophet, call a man as an apostle, call another woman as a pastor, call another woman as an evangelist. God can call anybody he wills, and you are not the one to tell God who he should use, how he should use, when he should use, where he should use. It's God that decides who he must use, when he must use, where he must use, for the purpose in which he's using the person. And when God has empowered someone to work, don't ever stand in God's way. Women should preach in churches. I'm very sure you understand this truth right now. Women should preach in churches. Don't ever stop women from ministering in churches. It'll be wrong and it'll be witchcraft. Let women teach in church. Let women preach in church and don't ever stop them.